y'all, Dixie here. Today I want to talk to you about the gear I took with me on my trip to Mount Kilimanjaro, what worked and the few things that didn't. First, some of your gear will be provided by the company that you go on the trip with. I booked my trip with Peak Planet, and if you're in the US or Canada, and I heard that they'll be covering some other areas eventually if they're not already, but I highly recommend them. Everything was very simple and straightforward, but whatever company you go with, they will likely provide the same stuff that Peak Planet did. There may be a few differences, but I assume most things will be pretty similar. The things that were supplied to me and the folks in my group were 4-season tents, a sleeping pad, and it was pretty thick, like a tumbling mat or something similar. All of our kitchen stuff, so including cups, utensils, plates, etc. And of course, no stove because they prepare and cook food for you. Peak Planet also made sure that we had water to use at camp, and they sent us to hike with water during the day, so you don't have to worry about taking any sort of filtration or water treatment. And as far as bathroom stuff goes, we had toilet paper provided to us in a private toilet tent at camp. I've heard that this can vary from company to company. Some companies you have to pay extra for a private toilet tent, or you might opt to just use the privies like everyone else, but this was something that came with the package from Peak Planet. And that was pretty much the bulk of what was supplied to us. Now, Peak Planet provided us with a gear list of things that we needed to take versus what they would make sure we had, and I assume whatever company you go with, if you don't go with Peak Planet, will do the same for you. Now let's go into what I brought myself on this trip, starting with bags. You've got to have a day pack and then a duffel bag. The day pack will be used to carry what it sounds like, what you'll need during the day. Things like rain gear, extra layers, snacks, water, any sort of camera equipment, or maybe a backup battery bank to charge your phone. Peak Planet recommends that you have a day pack that's 30 to 35 liters. That seems to be plenty for most folks. I was a little concerned that that wouldn't be enough for me just because I carry so much camera equipment with me, and even if it would be enough actual space, I didn't know if it would carry all of the heavy weight of my camera equipment comfortably, so I went with a 45-liter pack, but a specific one made for photography. And that is the Moment Stroll Mountain Light pack. I was really excited to use this pack, and I've had it for quite a while, but the main thing I was looking forward to is being able to carry my camera in the Peak Designs clip on my hip belt, and it really gave my shoulder a break. It worked out well. Other than being so used to quick drawing from my shoulder, I had to learn to quick draw from my hip. So retraining that muscle memory took a little while, and I might have missed a few shots because of it. But overall, if I could opt in for this on every single pack that I have, I would definitely choose that. But I'll do a separate review on that pack to let y'all know how it worked out for me if anybody's interested in that. It's also recommended that everybody carry a pack cover in case it rains, but I'm gonna go ahead and tell you something I've learned from thru hiking is those are pretty much worthless, and if you don't have redundancies to keep your stuff dry, you're gonna end up with your gear soaked on the inside. And this exact thing happened to several people on this trip. All they had was a pack cover for their day pack, and it got wet anyway. So I always use a pack liner. I carried a Nilo Fume pack liner from Garage Grown Gear. It's very lightweight, pretty inexpensive, but you could also use something like a trash compactor bag or just anything to make sure that the stuff in your pack, especially your extra layers, are kept dry. And even if your pack says that it's waterproof, I would make sure that you have redundancies and do this anyway, because you never know when there could be a little pinhole that causes a leak and now everything's soaked. On to the duffel. This is used for things that you won't be needing until you get to camp. So spare changes of clothing, extra batteries, spare footwear, your sleeping bag, etc. Anything that you need on the mountain but you're not going to need while you're hiking during the day, because once you pack it up and send it with the porters, you won't see it again until you get to camp. Peak Planet suggested 75 to 90 liters for a duffel bag size. I just went with something that I already had at the house. I'm not exactly sure what the volume of the bag is, but it held everything I needed to hold. But they invite you to remember that just because you have the space doesn't mean you have to pack it full. And although the weight limit of your duffel is 15 kilograms or 33 pounds, they want you to recognize that a human will be carrying this on the mountain. So if you're able to shave off some weight, then of course that would be much more comfortable for the porters. Something I would highly recommend is making sure that your duffel is waterproof, or that you have some sort of waterproofing system for it. Since I just used something I already had at the house that was not waterproof, I ordered a Z-Packs airplane case that's meant to go around packs when you're traveling at the airport, so your straps and stuff don't get hung up. But because it's made out of Dyneema, it's waterproof, and it only weighs 3.2 ounces. So I felt like this is something I could use in the future anyway. It would waterproof my bag and not add a bunch of extra weight to it, because sometimes waterproof duffels in and of themselves can already be kind of heavy. But if I didn't have a duffel bag that would work, I guess the most straightforward, easy thing to do would just be buying a waterproof duffel bag. Now, with this said, I made the mistake on the day that it was raining to not put my duffel bag in the Z-Packs airplane case and actually waterproof my bag. And even though the porters carry it in something that's like a tarp-like material to try to keep the water off of it, on the day that it rained, my bag got soaked anyway. Luckily, I had my sleeping bag and clothes and some other things in the duffel in dry sacks, so I had that redundancy and my most important stuff stayed dry, but there were things that I didn't want to get wet that did end up damp or wet. Now let's talk about the other gear. For sleeping bags, it's recommended that you have a 0-degree bag. My Enlightened Equipment Enigma is only a 20-degree, so I was a little concerned about this just because I always freeze at night, but when you're allergic to down, you're kind of limited to your options, and this is what I already had. So I just added on a sleeping bag liner. I went with the Sea to Summit Thermalite Reactor Extreme, and that adds up to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Because I know I'm not usually comfortable on foam pads, and I didn't know exactly what type of sleeping pad they were going to provide, how thick it would be or comfortable it would be, I decided to bring my own anyway, and I thought, well, it will also help keep me warm at night since my sleeping bag's rated a little bit higher than recommended. So I brought along a Nemo Tensor Insulated, which has an R value of 4.2, and it's a regular length sleeping pad, and that was a really nice change because normally I'd sleep with a knee length sleeping pad. So it's pretty warm, full length, and it only weighs 15 ounces. I highly recommend trekking poles for this trip. Some people walked without using them, but I don't feel normal without having something to do with my hands, and one of the girls on the trip complained about her hands swelling. I think it would have helped a lot if she had used trekking poles. So I just went with my old trusties, the Black Diamond Alpine Carbon Cork. Now let's talk about clothing, and this is something that I really stressed about because, like I said, I'm cold-natured and we pack our fears, and I didn't want to have the porters carrying 11 layers if they didn't have to. But also, I did the Lemosho 10-day route, which is actually 8 days on the mountain because you've got 1 day in a hotel before the trip, 1 day after the trip, so it's 8 on the mountain. If you're going on a shorter trip, you might not need as many clothes, obviously, so just keep that in mind. Definitely make sure that you have a warm beanie, and I also had a hood on my jacket, and then this little pullover hoodie thing here. It's pretty lightweight but fuzzy on the inside, has a hood. I carried 2 buffs with me, that way if one got wet and rained on, I would still have a dry one for summit day or while I was sleeping in my tent at night if I needed it. I carried my puffy coat. I don't have a down puffy anymore because, like I said, I'm allergic, but if you've got a down puffy, just whatever the warmest puffy coat you have, bring that. They recommend bringing 1 fleece layer, but I brought 2 so that I could have a sacrificial one to the rain. I wanted to know that I would have my puffy coat and a fleece layer for summit day, and I'm really glad that I did that because sure enough, one of them did get wet on our rainy day. I carried 2 short sleeve shirts because, again, the 8-day trek, I had the first 2 days on the mountain that were pretty warm, and then the last day. 3 long sleeve shirts to either hike or sleep in. Again, one being sacrificial in case it rains. And if it had rained another day, then I would have just had to put the cold, wet stuff back on, because as long as you're moving, you're usually good. 3 pairs of leggings to hike in, 2 pair of wool leggings to sleep in, and I had a more lightweight pair, and then I guess you would say a mid to heavyweight pair. 1 pair of fleece leggings, and then I actually ended up with 1 pair of hiking pants, because when we did our gear shakedown the day before we went up the mountain with some of the guides from Peak Planet, they didn't love my plan for just layering a bunch of leggings and throwing my rain pants on over the top of it. So they more or less kind of made me rent a pair of hiking pants, which ended up working out, and I did use them. 3 pair of underwear, and I did end up washing 1 pair and hanging them on my pack to dry. So maybe it would have been better if I'd had 4 pair. And 2 sports bras. I know this seems like a lot, but it was within the realm of what Peak Planet recommends. Maybe a tad bit more, but again, I know how cold-natured I am. But on summit day, I had on 5 layers on my top and 4 or 5 on my bottom, including my rain jacket and rain pants. But I was really happy by the time that I got to the top that I had all of that stuff. And there was even a brief moment right before the sun came up that I was like, I'm cold and I have on everything that I could possibly put on right now. For added warmth, I also carried some body warmers, hand warmers, and toe warmers. And each day before we got started hiking, usually the guides knew what to expect with the weather and how high we were going to be going in elevation, so they typically had some sort of suggestion of what you should take with you in your day pack and what we should wear on summit day. As far as gloves go, Peak Planet recommended 1 pair of thin gloves and then 1 pair of mittens that are warm and heavy duty and waterproof. Because of my experience through hiking, I took what I was familiar with. I went with some possum down gloves and then the Showa Timorous 281 bright blue waterproof gloves that Andrew Skirka recommended in a review. And that worked fine for me on the day that it was rainy and cold, just like it worked well for me during my thru hiking. But on summit day, I took with me a pair of battery heated gloves that I found on Amazon. They had pretty decent reviews, but unfortunately nobody had trekked Kilimanjaro and left a review from that experience. So I found that they worked well. They did attempt to keep my hands warm, and my palms were certainly warmer than they would have been in probably regular bulky mittens, but they failed at keeping my fingertips warm. And there was a point where, you know, my fingertips were just freezing. And unfortunately the battery pack didn't last for the full summit, so they were all right, but I would go with something different going forward in the future. I will say, whatever you take as far as waterproofing goes for your hands, make sure before you go that it actually is waterproof. Like, test it under a sink if you have to, submerge your hands in water, whatever you got to do, because there were several people on the trip who thought their gloves were waterproof and they ended up with freezing cold hands. Now let's talk about footwear. Most people who summit Mount Kilimanjaro do so in hiking boots, and everybody in my group except for me and Rodney had on hiking boots. But I prefer trail runners, and I had a patron who did this exact trip a year before, and although he wore hiking boots for summit day, he told me, Dixie, I'd have been happy in trail runners, and I think it could definitely be done in trail runners if that's what you prefer. So because that is definitely what I prefer, I went with trail runners. Now, there is a change I would make if I could go back in time and do it again, and that is I would go with waterproof trail runners. Now, I know a lot of you who have seen my Gore-Tex video are like, I'm sorry, what? But I do still stand by that on a thru hike, I would never wear Gore-Tex trail runners again. I have in the past, and I don't like them. But this is a different trip. You're dealing with much colder temperatures than you typically do on a thru hike, and it's just a different beast. So sometimes it's hard for me to get out of the thru hiker mindset. You know, on this trip I didn't have to suffer, and on thru hikes sometimes you just suck it up for the sake of carrying less stuff. So the change I would make, in addition to the Gore-Tex or waterproof trail runners, is some waterproof gaiters. That's just something I would never carry on a thru hike. But on this trip, it would have kept my feet dry on the rainy day. Now, I actually wasn't really that uncomfortable while we were moving and trucking down the trail, but it made me a little bit nervous that my trail runners were soaked. I was afraid that they would still be wet on summit day. And on summit day, having the extra windproofing, I think would have been more comfortable, and having the extra warmth on my legs from the gaiters. But I ended up having some toe warmers, so I was just fine. And I had a backup plan of using Dyneema stuff sacks to put my feet in and then put them into the trail runners if they were in fact wet on summit day. But while I had a plan, I still think the waterproof trail runners and waterproof gaiters would have been a better idea. In addition to your hiking shoes, Peak Planet said it's a good idea to have some sort of camp shoes or tennis shoes, so I carried some pair of Brooks shoes that I use for running, and it was nice having those at camp, especially on the day that it rained, to have a warm, dry pair of shoes to walk around camp in. For socks, I carried 4 pair to hike in. They were variable lengths. I had some ankle socks for the warmer days and some full-length socks for the cooler days. And finally, I had 1 really thick pair to sleep in. Now let's cover hydration. It is very important to stay hydrated while you are hiking up at higher elevations so that you can help your body acclimate more easily. But the first thing you should know is that disposable, one-time use, smart water bottle type bottles are not allowed on Kilimanjaro. So you've got to carry something like a Nalgene bottle. I found some pretty lightweight Nalgenes on Amazon, and then we also went with the 3-liter platypus bladder tube hydration system because it's more convenient to drink from the bladder and the tube while you're hiking. You know, you're trucking along pretty good with the group. You take some spread out breaks, but trying to drink from an Nalgene and busting your teeth up while you're walking down the trail just isn't as easy as drinking through the tube. But I did like having the Nalgenes for drink mixes, and also on summit day, those came in pretty handy because your bladder and your tube will pretty much freeze solid, but your Nalgene bottles you can keep upside down. And so with them upside down, the bottoms will freeze, and when you go to drink, you can invert it, and you might have a thin layer of ice you'll have to bust out, but you can still drink out of the Nalgenes, where the bladder and tube at a certain point will be useless. As far as capacity goes, I carried 1 Nalgene, and then I had the 3-liter platypus bladder. They recommend that you drink 3 to 4 liters per day, so you know, I felt like 4 liters capacity was going to be plenty for me. And with having the 8-day trek, carrying that amount of water for pretty short days was definitely plenty. Rodney, he drinks more. He went with 2 Nalgene bottles and the 3-liter platypus. So it really depends on the person and how many miles you're going to be doing during the day. Next, let's talk about electronics. I typically carry a rechargeable headlamp. That's just my preferred choice. But on this trek, I knew on summit day, I'd need to have that headlamp for hours. And knowing how sometimes my headlamp has died in the past while I night hike for a lot of hours, I figured having a headlamp that I could take the batteries in and out would make more sense, so I could just carry extra batteries on summit day if I ended up needing them. I opted for a black diamond headlamp I found at REI, and it was really bright and worked well. The only gripe I have about this headlamp is that the band didn't seem to stay tight, so it's something I had to fuss with a little bit, but other than that, it was just fine. I carried my InReach Mini, and I'm really glad that I did because I didn't have much service on the trail. I think I would have had more service had I opted for a local SIM card, but unfortunately they didn't sell any that I could find at the airport, and I just didn't really think about it while I was in town because I had pretty decent service there with the Verizon Wireless Travel Pass. So that's something you might want to look into if you actually want to have service on trail. I just know that the guides and porters had a lot more service at different points than I did. But the InReach worked just fine for being able to communicate with family and friends and let them know I was okay. You definitely want to carry a backup battery bank with you if you'd like to charge any devices or electronics while you're out there, because there is nowhere to charge those on the mountain. I carried like 3 30,000 milliamp hour battery banks, but that is definitely excessive for most people. Rodney had just one 30,000 milliamp hour battery bank, and he didn't even use the majority of that. But the only thing he was charging was his cell phone, so it just really depends on what you have and what you need to keep powered up. Of course, you'll need any power cords for the devices that you're charging, and you will need, for in town to charge your stuff before you go, a Type G adapter. Again, the link for this stuff will be in the lighter packs in the video description, but there's no point in carrying this on the mountain again because there are no outlets. One electronic that I really just carried for fun was a pulse oximeter. I wanted to check my pulse ox at the top, but I forgot about it. It was just cold and hectic, and it just kind of slipped my mind. But it was something that I kind of enjoyed checking during the day while I was hiking or in my tent after resting at night. The guides did have a pulse oximeter with them that they used to do health checks in the evening, so you'll be checked out, but this was just something extra I carried for fun. And of course, any camera equipment you want, because there will definitely be picture-worthy things out there on the trail. If you want to see what I carried, I'm not gonna go into it here and make this video even longer, but you can check it out on my lighter packs list. Things to protect you from the sun and the rain. First, sunglasses. And they suggest that you have full coverage sunglasses. I definitely would go with something good to protect your eyes since you're gonna be at higher elevations. You don't want like the $5 Dollar General special. I had a sun hat with me, just something I've picked up along the way, but you just want something to protect your face, your ears, and your neck, because for most of the trek you will be exposed. Of course, some sunscreen, some chapstick with sunscreen, and I also had a lightweight umbrella that could have been used on those sunny days or for the rainy day that we had. Unfortunately, I forgot to pack it with me in my day pack, so I never ended up using it, but it is something that could be useful on the mountain, and I did see other folks using umbrellas. And then of course I had a rain jacket and rain pants. I went with my anti-gravity gear, raincoat, and rain breeches. I had several different options, but I went with the anti-gravity gear stuff because it just seemed the most heavyweight of the ultralight rain gear that I have, but it did the trick. I appreciated having the pit zips on the coat to help regulate my temperature, and I never longed for something thicker or more heavyweight. Of course, you'll probably want some toiletries. You might need a repair kit, and it is recommended to have some sort of basic first aid kit. So for the stuff in this category, I carried hand sanitizer and a roll of toilet paper in my day pack in case I needed to go during the day while we were walking and not in camp. Thankfully, I never had to do more than just pee on the side of the mountain, but I assure you, I saw on the surface that a lot of people have had to do otherwise during the day while hiking. I also carried a few baby wipes with me during the day, pretty much for the same purpose, but also a bigger pack in my duffel bag to kind of use to bathe with in the evenings. Now, they do supply you with soap and water to use to kind of wash up, but I liked having baby wipes also. Peak Planet recommended that we carry insect repellent with DEET. We had it with us, but we actually never used it. For our first aid kit, we just picked up something basic at Academy Sports and Outdoors and threw it in the duffel bag. They recommend also having a blister kit, but I know I'm not blister prone. And for my repair kit, I had duct tape, so I knew in a pinch I could use that. In addition to the duct tape for my repair kit, I carried a needle and floss like I always do, and it almost came in handy because one of the dudes had a blowout on his britches, but the guides had needle and thread, so they fixed him up. It's recommended that you have some earplugs, and I didn't actually go with earplugs. I took my Apple AirPods that have the noise cancellation, and those worked fine for me. I just don't do well with earplugs. I kind of like hear my own heartbeat, and it freaks me out. I just don't like it, but I would definitely recommend having something with you to reduce the noise, because there will be times, especially on summit day, where you have like a nap time, but just because it's nap time doesn't mean that everybody in camp is quiet. So if you want to actually have a chance to go to bed early or take a nap, then you'll want to kind of shut out the noise somehow. And then of course your basic toiletries like toothbrush, toothpaste. Don't be a disgusting animal and don't brush your teeth, because other people will suffer smelling your breath. Peak Planet recommended that we carry a camp towel, so I did, but to be honest, I never really used it. I think I busted it out one time to kind of dry some stuff off after the rainy day and everything got soaked, but for what I used it for, I honestly could have just used a bandana and it would have taken up less space and been more lightweight. But that's personal preference. Also, don't forget any needed medications and prescriptions. I always carry an anti-diarrheal and pain reliever on trail, but I also took with me the 3 medications recommended by Peak Planet, which is something to treat traveler's diarrhea if you find yourself in that situation, malaria preventative Malarone, and Diamox to help acclimate to higher elevations. And now for the final category, miscellaneous. First, I carried a little cash with me. Now, it's recommended that you leave all of your valuables like your passport, ID, cash, etc. at the lodge. And at the Stella Marie, they actually packed it up in a bag and taped it up and had me sign my name, and they counted the money, and we agreed on how much was there and wrote it down and all that stuff, and then they lock it up. But the reason I recommend having a little bit of cash is we stopped at a store along the way, like on the route to the mountain, and then at the gate they actually have a little shop there if you need to get some gear in a pinch or if you want some espresso, for example. So I would take a little bit with you. Also, a side note, and I will mention this in other videos about this experience where I give kind of details about the trek, but make sure you have cash at least at the hotel for the porters, because it is recommended that you tip your porters and guides, but you have to actually have the cash to give to the guides once you make it back to the lodge. Some more miscellaneous items. Obviously, I kind of mentioned these before, but dry bags is something to think about. The redundancies on keeping your stuff dry in your duffel bag, like your sleeping bag, clothes, etc. I would also highly recommend carrying a bunch of various size Ziplocs. You never know when you might need those, and when you do need them and you have them, they really come in handy. And of course, I always carry my handy dandy MT Knives neck knife. And finally, it was suggested that we have some sort of snacks with us. They actually, on the longer days, provided some snacks, and I really didn't find myself snacking too much, but I would certainly carry a handful of bars or something like that with you. Also, I really enjoyed having some electrolyte mixes to mix up in my Nalgene bottle, so if that's something you're into, make sure you pick those up. And finally, I carried beet powder to put in my water bottle also. That was on recommendation by Aaron, who edits the videos on this channel. He said it helped him with acclimating to the higher altitudes on the Continental Divide Trail, so I took his word for it, and I didn't try not having the beet juice, so I can't tell you how it would have been without it, but I managed to summit, and the beet juice might have played a part. So that is all the gear that I carried with me on Mount Kilimanjaro. Now, if you're freaking out because you want to do a trek like Kilimanjaro, but you don't want to purchase all of this gear in addition to paying a lot of money for the trip, and you don't have everything you need, keep in mind that a lot of these companies, Peak Planet included, will rent out gear to you. So this includes puffies, they even do duffel bags, like I said, hiking pants, etc. So whatever company you're looking at booking with, you can always ask them what they have available, and that might even help you decide what company to go with. And one final note, if you are concerned about what am I going to do with all of this extra stuff that I might carry with me to Africa, like if I'm going to go on a safari afterwards, or maybe, even just the clothes that I fly to and from Africa in. What do I do with all that stuff and my luggage? In my situation, the lodge that we stayed at actually kept all of that extra stuff that we didn't need on the mountain for us until we returned, because we stayed with them the night before the trip and then the night after the trip. So I would assume that most of these places that deal with Kilimanjaro treks will be willing to do the same. Well, all right, y'all, that is all I have for you today on gear needed to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. If you have any questions about the gear that I took with me or what's needed, feel free to leave that in the comments below. Also, I'm gonna be doing some more informational videos on just the logistics of this trip. So if you've got questions about that and you want them answered in those videos, then be sure to leave those in the comments also. Thank y'all so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe before you go, and we will see y'all next time.